causal reality, helplessness as an intolerable condition, control as preferable to emotional dependence, irreversible outcomes as psychologically attractive, and transformation as more important than preservation. The speaker does not appear primarily motivated by happiness, nor does ordinary individual human welfare function as the highest value. The rhetoric repeatedly places other ends above it: proof, strength, control, historical consequence, species development, conquest, definitiveness, and the capacity to impose or sustain a direction. That produces a psychological architecture that is simultaneously severe and more complicated than straightforward domination. There are genuine moral residues in the text. There are restrictions on legitimate authority. There is sympathy with suffering. There is an explicit concern about tyranny. There is even recognition that models which abstract people can become morally defective. Models reduce people to numbers. Ethics puts the people back in. Strengths repeatedly compete with a much stronger attraction to effectiveness, finality, hierarchy, and civilizational transformation. Power appears to be the speaker's fundamental explanatory category. The most basic proposition is not actually might makes right. It is closer to might makes outcome. That distinction is central. Power does not need a reason. Means that an excellent justification cannot itself prevent superior causal force from defeating the person who possesses the justification. The tank metaphor makes exactly this point. Reasoning and power inhabit different categories. An argument can be correct while the person making it is physically destroyed. The recovered manual reinforces this interpretation. Open quote, everything is downstream from power. Close quote. It then distinguishes force from authority, treating authority as stronger precisely because obedience can continue without immediate external compulsion. It also says that individual men lack real power, and that power ultimately depends upon persuading other people to act. This is important psychologically fascinated with muscular strength or violence. The object of fascination is causal capacity, the ability to make reality move in a direction. Violence is therefore interesting insofar as it is one mechanism of power. Authority, persuasion, institutional obedience, superior organization, demographic continuity, technological superiority, and collective action are potentially greater forms of power. This makes the worldview substantially more sophisticated than primitive strong beats weak thinking. Weakness is treated less as innocence than as dependency. The speaker does not appear to romanticize weakness. Weakness does not automatically produce moral authority. Indeed, the rhetoric is suspicious of the idea that vulnerability itself grants somebody superior standing. That appears in the strange but revealing man and dog example. The stronger observer is not instructed simply to side with the human or simply to side with the weaker animal. The observer evaluates what happened. If the dog attacked the man may legitimately defend himself. If the man gratuitously harms the dog, the observer may use superior power against the man. Thus, power establishes capacity, but judgment determines how that capacity is used. This prevents the philosophy from being pure predator morality. The powerful are not automatically righteous, yet the weaker party also does not automatically acquire moral supremacy because it is weaker. The speaker therefore appears deeply hostile to what might be called the moralization of helplessness. Weakness may create dependency, vulnerability, or a need for protection, but it does not necessarily create wisdom, correctness, authority, or virtue. This is a strongly hierarchical conception of relationships, but it is not quite the strong should torment the weak. It is closer to the strong inevitably possess disproportionate capacity. Therefore, the morally significant question is what the strong do with that capacity. That interpretation is supported by another recovered fragment. Open quote, a king becomes a tyrant when no voice but his own can reach him. Close quote. Open quote, a king becomes a tyrant the moment correction becomes insult. Close quote. Those statements place an important limitation upon authority. The speaker therefore admires hierarchy while simultaneous mechanism within hierarchy. Power becomes pathological when power becomes incapable of receiving correction. That is a genuine internal restraint. The central psychological enemy may be helplessness rather than morality. The recovered manual contains perhaps the clearest motivational statement in the entire source set. Open quote, I sought strength because I did not want to be helpless ever again. Close quote. It sits beside. Open quote, I do not chase happiness, I chase proof. Close quote. Open quote, if I'm not allowed happiness, I'll allow myself pride. Close quote. Open quote, happy emotions to me would be clouds, less control. Close quote. Taken together, these statements suggest that power is not merely an intellectual, ontological function. It protects against helplessness. This makes anti-helplessness one of the strongest candidate organizing motives in the corpus. The speaker repeatedly prefers conditions that minimize vulnerability, certainty over uncertainty, strength over dependence, proof over hope, control over emotional surrender, definitive elimination over continuing resistance, homogeneity over competing directions, one civilizational trajectory over plural trajectories, long-term continuity over the collapse of leadership. Even the fascination with extermination can be understood partly through this lens. The psychologically salient feature of complete extermination is not merely death. It is the impossibility of reversal. The enemy cannot return. The predator cannot hunt again. The defeated population cannot rebel. The former claimant cannot exercise a future claim. Something uncertain has become certain. Something potentially resistant has become incapable of resistance. That is why it is definitive may be more psychologically revealing than the violent imagery surrounding it. The speaker seems attracted to closed causal systems. Death is conceptualized primarily as termination of agency. The rhetoric surrounding death is unusually impersonal. Death is repeatedly described through what it prevents: no resistance, no future hunting, no competing claim, no reproduction, no escape, no opposition. The person who dies is therefore often represented less as a subjective consciousness than as a future causal agent whose future actions have been reduced to zero. That is an extremely abstract treatment of mortality. The phrase mathematical equation captures the cognitive style particularly well. Death converts contingency into certainty. This does not establish enjoyment of death. There is surprisingly little evidence of pleasure in suffering itself. That distinction should be maintained. A sadistic speaker would ordinarily make suffering, humiliation, fear, or pain intrinsically rewarding. Here, the repeated fascination is instead with definitiveness. The speaker seems substantially more interested in what can never happen afterward than how much did the victim suffer. That does not make the rhetoric benign. In some respects, it makes it more severe, because enormous destruction can be discussed without emotional engagement with the experience of those being destroyed. But psychologically, it is different from sadism. The most plausible terms are instrumentalization, abstraction, and finality seeking, rather than pleasure in cruelty. The extermination passages represent the most dangerous logic in the corpus. The strongest severe interpretation has to take these statements seriously. The passage about defeating an enemy not merely through military victory, but through killing descendants, preventing reproduction, preventing escape, disturbing graves, and finding every last one, is unmistakably exterminatory rhetoric. The appendix substantially changes what can reasonably be inferred about intention. It tells us this was deliberately constructed to isolate the proposition that completely eliminating a population eliminates that population's subsequent capacity to resist. That context sharply reduces the evidentiary value of the passage as evidence of an operational desire to commit extermination. It does not, however, erase what the rhetoric reveals conceptually. The speaker can mentally represent total extermination as a legitimate analytical variable. Moreover, the rhetoric is capable of temporarily suppressing nearly every competing consideration: ecology, happiness, morality, prosperity, future civilization, in order to examine extermination exclusively through causal effectiveness. That indicates an unusually high capacity for moral compartmentalization. The pattern is: open quote, strip away the emotional variables, close quote, open quote, strip away conventional moral judgment, close quote, open quote, define the desired causal result, close quote, open quote, ask what action guarantees the result, close quote. This is powerful analytical reasoning when applied to engineering or systems problems. Applied to human beings, it creates obvious dangers because the abstraction can make human subjects disappear inside the model. The speaker appears partially aware of that danger. The recovered statement, models reduce people to numbers. Ethics puts the people back in, almost sounds like recognition of the failure mode inherent in the speaker's own thinking. That self-awareness is significant. Morality is demoted but not abolished. The speaker is not a clean nihilist, would have difficulty coherently asserting it is wrong to allow people to live in pain and suffering. It is wrong to allow people to live in squalor, or condemning gratuitous harm to an animal, or distinguishing kingship from tyranny, or saying ethics restores people who have disappeared inside models. The rhetoric therefore contains moral propositions. What it rejects is apparently not morality itself, but morality as the first or dominant analytical language. Morality distracts, suggests that the speaker believes moral reactions can prevent accurate description of causal relationships. This creates a hierarchy. First, understand what power can actually do, then perhaps ask whether it should be done. That order is psychologically characteristic of the corpus. The danger is that the second step can disappear. Once effectiveness becomes intellectually compelling, moral judgment can become an irritating external constraint rather than an integrated component of reasoning. But the corpus never completely eliminates morality. It oscillates between moral distancing and moral re-entry. The mercy argument reveals paternalistic consequentialism. The mercy section is especially revealing. It is wrong to allow people to live in pain and suffering. It is merciful to take them away from all of this. It is merciful to end them. This reasoning begins with compassion and reaches annihilation. That makes it psychologically different from hatred. The speaker can apparently reach an extremely destructive conclusion through an argument whose emotional premise is the reduction of suffering. The severe interpretation is annihilatory paternalism. The decision-maker determines that another person's life is sufficiently undesirable that eliminating the person becomes an act of mercy. The moral danger is obvious. The person suffering disappears from the decision about whether his or her life remains valuable. The more charitable interpretation is philosophical boundary testing. The speaker is exploring whether reducing suffering can logically be taken so far that it contradicts ordinary intuitions about mercy. The corpus alone cannot establish which interpretation dominates outside rhetoric. But the pattern illustrates something broader. The speaker is willing to follow principles beyond conventional stopping points. That tendency appears repeatedly. If conquest is the objective, why stop at 80%? If evolution is the objective, why exempt the current generation? If power determines outcomes, why pretend reasons compel power? If eliminating an adversary prevents opposition, why stop at partial defeat? If agency can continually be expanded, why stop asking, could I? at ordinary occupations rather than could one be God. The mind repeatedly presses premises toward their terminal limit. That may be one of its most distinctive cognitive habits. The terminal goal is transformation, not happiness. Saving the world is explicitly separated from saving the people. This may be the single clearest statement of the speaker's teleology. The object of loyalty is not necessarily the currently existing population. It is something larger and more abstract. The world, the species, civilization, the future, perhaps the continuity of directed development itself. That helps explain why the rhetoric can accept sacrifice on enormous scales without becoming straightforwardly egoistic. All humans are worthy of sacrifice is followed by the explicit inclusion of the speaker. That means the speaker's hierarchy does not simply place the self at the top. The self can also become material for the larger project. This considerably weakens the interpretation of ordinary selfish egoism. A more accurate characterization would be transpersonal consequentialism. The person places an abstract future objective above both strangers and self. The goal is also unusual because it is not conventional utilitarianism. There is no attempt to maximize happiness. The speaker openly questions why happiness should be civilization's objective. Instead, the desired outcome involves development, survival, conquest, intelligence, expansion, direction, and significance. The philosophy therefore resembles a kind of civilizational teleology more than ordinary consequentialism. Human beings are simultaneously valued and instrumentalized. The corpus has a striking split in how humanity is represented. At one level, humans are animals, monkeys to be bred, populations to be homogenized, material for evolution, sacrificable individuals, competitors occupying scarce planetary space. At another level, humans are fascinating. They make history, they need stories, they create civilizations, they aspire, they transform worlds. The recovered manual provides an almost direct acknowledgement of this contradiction. Open quote, I think I romanticize humans, and that's my only mistake. Close quote, this is not straightforward misanthropy. A misanthrope principally dislikes humanity. This speaker appears simultaneously disappointed by of and grandly ambitious for humanity. Current humans can be treated dismissively while the human species is endowed with extraordinary destiny. That produces a peculiar inversion of ordinary humanism. Humanity matters enormously. Individual humans may matter very little. That distinction runs through much of the corpus. Conquest is a terminal value, not merely a political instrument. The rhetoric makes conquest unusually important. Conquest does not end when immediate security is achieved. 80% is explicitly insufficient. Planetary conquest leads to interstellar expansion. Interstellar expansion introduces competition with other life. The preferred encounter is with weaker life. This indicates genuine expansionist imagination. But what conquest psychologically supplies is worth distinguishing from conquest itself. Conquest provides direction, proof of capability, elimination of rivals, unification, reduction of uncertainty, an expanding frontier, historical significance, a project that can continue indefinitely. That last feature may be particularly important. Once the whole planet has been unified, the project does not end. The frontier simply moves outward. This suggests that conquest may function psychologically as an infinite project of agency. The endpoint continuously recedes. There is always another boundary against which capability can be tested. Grandiosity is clearly present, but its type is uncertain. The godhood passage cannot reasonably be called modest rhetoric. Could one be God is grandiose language. So are kings, thrones, Alexander, planetary conquest, interstellar civilizations, species evolution, monsters, darkness, and thousand-year judgment. But several pieces of evidence argue against interpreting this naively as a literal belief in extraordinary personal status. The recovered manual explicitly says, open quote, the world is a stage, every social interaction are little plays, close quote. Open quote, I play a character because it is strategically useful, close quote. Open quote, everything we do is so performative, close quote. That establishes unusually strong textual evidence that the speaker understands theatrical presentation as theatrical presentation. Other statements further complicate Simen. I don't think I'm special. There are no great men. Individual men lack real power. And the godhood appendix explicitly frames the question as the maximal extension of a recurring agency test, rather than literal divinity. The strongest reading is therefore self-aware rhetorical grandiosity. The speaker deliberately thinks at maximal scale. Possible psychological functions include testing conceptual limits, constructing an identity around strength, turning personal agency into mythology, making abstract arguments memorable, countering feelings of helplessness, or simply enjoying dramatic rhetoric. A compensatory grandiosity interpretation is plausible, especially given I sought strength because I did not want to be helpless ever again. But rhetoric alone cannot establish the developmental cause. Literal delusions of grandeur are not supported. Proof may matter more than possession. I do not chase happiness. I chase proof changes the interpretation of the entire corpus. The speaker may not simply want to have power. The speaker may want evidence that power was possible. This is subtly different. The occupational sequence ending in could one be God follows precisely this structure. Can this be done? Can this capacity be acquired? Where is the boundary? What is impossible? Power thus becomes epistemic. Achievement proves something about agency. The deeper motivational question becomes not what would make life pleasant, but what am I capable of making real? This may explain why ordinary happiness seems comparatively uninteresting. Happiness does not necessarily prove agency. Transformation does. Conquest does. Survival does. Mastery does. Doing what previously appeared impossible does. The speaker therefore appears strongly achievement-oriented, but achievement has been elevated into an existential test. Control appears to be preferred over positive emotion. The statement that happy emotions would be clouds, less control, is psychologically unusual. Positive emotion is not merely unavailable or unimportant. It is treated as potentially destabilizing. Pride is preferable, because pride can apparently coexist with control. This suggests an over-controlled emotional style. The recovered manual strengthens that interpretation. Open quote. I think I have built myself into something highly functional but not optimized for living. Close quote. Open quote. I have lived my life with the determination of proving I do not need another human being on this planet. Close quote. Open quote. The systems I built to survive may now be interfering with peace. Close quote. Those statements are remarkably self-observant. Whatever caused the system cannot be recovered from the rhetoric alone, but the system itself can be described. Dependence is reduced, emotion is disguised, vulnerability is minimized, competence becomes identity. Survival strategies become generalized beyond the circumstances in which they were useful. The speaker even recognizes a possible cost. What produces survivability may interfere with actually living peacefully. This is one of the clearest psychologically reflective passages in the corpus. Indifference is more strongly supported than generalized hatred. The corpus contains explicit indifference. Why care about distant strangers merely because they exist? Why should their interests automatically become one's concern? Why should one political death matter greatly in the scale of history? This supports a form of limited moral identification. The speaker does not automatically extend emotional concern to every human being. That differs substantially from hatred. Hatred requires negative emotional investment. Indifference requires very little investment at all. The recovered statement about possessing a well of hatred does establish that hatred is part of the speaker's emotional vocabulary, but the source itself identifies no target. Consequently, the existence of intense hatred is textually supported. Generalized hatred of humanity is not. Indeed, fascination with humanity, species ambition, pity, mercy, pride, and romanticization all argue against simple toward individuals is much better supported than hatred of humanity. The rhetoric aestheticizes history and power. Think how interesting that would make the world. Chaos would change the world. It would be interesting. It would not be boring. These statements reveal an aesthetic dimension that should not be dismissed. History is valuable partly because it creates stories. Large events possess narrative weight. Transformation is interesting. Stasis is boring. This creates a potential separation between human consequences and historical spectacle. A catastrophe can be terrible for the people experiencing it, while simultaneously appearing fascinating when viewed from the scale of centuries. The speaker appears capable of inhabiting the latter perspective. This does not prove enjoyment of suffering. It does suggest attraction to historical intensity. An uneventful, peaceful, prosperous period may have less imaginative appeal than transformation, crisis, conquest, collapse, or founding. This gives the rhetoric an unmistakably aesthetic component. Power is not only functional, it is dramatic. History is not only causal, it is narrative. The 1,000-year perspective serves both insight and self-protection. One does not wish to be judged by the ethical standards of mortals. They can only see tomorrow. If they could see 1,000 years, they would understand. This is a powerful rhetorical maneuver. It places the speaker, or the imagined actor, outside ordinary temporal judgment. Current observers cannot see enough. Future consequences will vindicate what appears wrong today. There is a coherent philosophical problem underneath this. Long-term policy can indeed produce consequences not visible to contemporaries. But the rhetoric creates an epistemic danger. If present criticism can always be dismissed by appealing to a future too distant to observe, the theory becomes resistant to falsification. The speaker's own appendix recognizes this issue. Psychologically, this move may serve two functions simultaneously. It expresses genuine long-horizon thinking, and it creates insulation from present moral judgment. That tension is important. Other people occupy several different roles rather than one. The corpus does not contain one stable theory of other persons. At different moments, other people appear as subjects deserving protection, sources of judgment and correction, dependents of stronger actors, competitors, obstacles, potential enemies, causal units inside systems, biological material for future evolution, members of a larger species project, audiences for historical action, and occasionally beings whose suffering itself generates moral concern. The distinction seems partly scale-dependent. At interpersonal scale, the speaker can recognize individuals. The man and dog are judged according to circumstances. A tyrant should hear correction. Suffering matters. At civilizational scale, individuals increasingly disappear into aggregates. Populations become opponents. Humans become biological material. Generations become sacrifices. Planets become resources. This shift from person-level thinking to systems-level thinking may be one of the most psychologically consequential features of the rhetoric. The monster is probably an identity metaphor rather than a literal self-description. The monster language combines fear, pride, civility, alienation, and theatricality. I consider myself the politest monster you'd ever meet. The image is deliberately paradoxical. Monster indicates danger, difference, intensity, or feared social interpretation. Politeness introduces discipline and restraint. The appendix is especially informative because it associates monster with the nearby statement, I feel that I'm just trying to learn how to be a person and not be seen as a monster. That substantially weakens the interpretation that the speaker simply embraces monstrousness. The monster seems partly like a feared identity and partly like an aesthetic identity. The final corpus statement captures this ambiguity. Not all monsters are astir wounds differently when there is some possibility that it is truthful. That sounds less like boasting than uneasy self-examination. The speaker is asking whether possessing disturbing ideas, emotional intensity, or unusual detachment makes someone monstrous even without corresponding action. That is psychologically quite different from declaring an intention to behave monstrously. Overall assessment. 1. Strongest overall psychological portrait. The strongest portrait is of a highly control-oriented, agency-centered, hierarchical, long-horizon thinker whose rhetoric is organized around escaping helplessness and maximizing causal effectiveness. The speaker appears to value strength because strength makes dependence less necessary. Power is fascinating because power turns intention into reality. Definitiveness is attractive because definitiveness eliminates uncertainty and future resistance. Historical transformation is valued because transformation demonstrates agency and creates significance. The worldview is not conventionally hedonistic, liberal, egalitarian, religious, or humanitarian. It is closer to a form of civilizational consequentialism combined with power realism. Individual welfare is subordinate to larger imagined objectives such as transformation, species development, continuity, conquest, or survival. Yet the worldview is not cleanly nihilistic because the speaker possesses strong values. It is not cleanly egoistic because the speaker explicitly includes the self among the expendable. It is not cleanly sadistic because suffering itself is rarely represented as pleasurable. It is not cleanly misanthropic because humanity is simultaneously admired, romanticized, and assigned enormous future significance. And it is not straightforwardly authoritarian because the speaker recognizes corruption in unchecked authority and explicitly values correction. The underlying psychological theme is probably less, I want people to suffer, than, I do not want reality, or myself, to remain helpless before uncertainty, resistance, weakness, or limitation. That interpretation has considerably stronger support. Most important recurring traits and motivational patterns. 1. Anti-helplessness. Strength is explicitly pursued to prevent helplessness. 2. Control orientation. Emotional states, dependence, uncertainty, and uncontrolled resistance are repeatedly treated with suspicion. 3. Agency testing. The recurring question is not merely what should happen, but what can be made to happen, and how far personal or collective capacity can extend. 4. Power realism. Power is treated as the substrate beneath authority, morality, politics, and historical outcome. 5. Finality seeking. Definitive outcomes possess unusual psychological attraction. Irreversibility repeatedly functions as a virtue. 6. Civilizational rather than individual valuation. Humanity or civilization may be valued while individual humans remain expendable. 7. Hierarchical thinking. Strong and weak are meaningful categories, and stronger entities are frequently given greater practical or evaluative standing. 8. Emotional overcontrol and self-sufficiency. Pride, functionality, independence, and discipline are preferred to emotional reliance and perhaps even happiness. 9. Deliberate theatrical grandiosity. Kings, gods, monsters, conquest, darkness, history, and species destiny form a consciously dramatic rhetorical vocabulary. 10. Boundary testing. Principles are repeatedly driven toward extreme logical endpoints in order to discover whether the principle still holds there. 3. Strongest internal contradictions and tensions. The corpus contains several genuine tensions, but many are psychologically compatible rather than logically impossible. Power is described as morally neutral, yet greater power is occasionally treated as deserving victory. The speaker shifts between explaining power and valorizing it. Humanity is romanticized, while humans are instrumentalized. The species can be magnificent, while current individuals are treated as replaceable components. Suffering is condemned, while killing can be described as mercy. Compassion therefore coexists with a willingness to extinguish the subject being compassionately considered. The speaker values hierarchy while condemning tyranny. Authority is desirable, but apparently only while authority can still be corrected. The speaker imagines godhood while denying the mythology of the great man. Personal agency is dramatized enormously, yet the speaker also recognizes that individual power depends on others. The speaker professes indifference while exhibiting fascination. Distant persons may not command compassion, but humanity, history, conquest, predators, civilizations, and power clearly command intense intellectual attention. The speaker values certainty while claiming to prioritize accurate questioning. There is an attraction to definitive answers alongside a self-image of epistemic caution. The speaker disvalues happiness while recognizing that survival-oriented systems may interfere with peace. This suggests at least partial awareness that control has costs. 4. Most severe reasonable interpretation. The strongest severe interpretation is that the rhetoric contains the intellectual architecture of a totalizing, hierarchical, anti-pluralist political morality capable of rationalizing extreme coercion and extermination. Under this interpretation, people progressively lose intrinsic standing as the scale of analysis increases. Individuals become means. Populations become variables. Resistance becomes a technical problem. Death becomes an irreversible solution. Morality becomes secondary to effectiveness. Future civilization becomes capable of justifying present sacrifice. Homogeneity becomes desirable because pluralism produces competing directions. Superior power becomes not merely causally dominant, but normatively privileged. Mercy can be redefined so that eliminating sufferers becomes compassionate. A sufficiently grand future objective could therefore absorb almost any present cost. This is the most dangerous coherent interpretation because such a worldview, if literally adopted as a governing ethic, contains very few obvious internal barriers against atrocity once atrocity is judged instrumentally necessary. That conclusion concerns the logic of the rhetoric. It is not evidence that the anonymous speaker intends to commit such acts. The corpus provides no operational plan, target, preparation, timeline, or demonstrated behavior from which such an intention could responsibly be inferred. 5. Most charitable, reasonable interpretation. The strongest charitable interpretation is that the speaker is conducting an unusually aggressive philosophical stress test. The speaker deliberately removes moral language temporarily in order to ask what power actually does, pushes propositions toward grotesque extremes to expose their logical limits, uses theatrical language because theatricality makes abstract ideas memorable, and is self-aware enough to recognize both the performance and the dangers of excessive abstraction. On this reading, extermination is not a wish, but the maximum test case for a proposition about resistance. Godhood is not delusion, but the maximal form of, what am I capable of? Monster is not a desired identity, but anxiety about what extreme thinking might imply about the thinker. Indifference is not hatred, but refusal to pretend universal emotional attachment. The pursuit of power is fundamentally a response to helplessness. The preference for control is a developed survival strategy. The species-level rhetoric represents a search for purposes larger than personal happiness. And the harshness of the corpus reflects a thinker who would rather follow an argument into disturbing territory than soften it merely because its implications are unpleasant. The recovered line, I am not trying to be early with an answer, I am trying to be accurate in the question, strongly supports this interpretation of the speaker as someone who identifies with inquiry and conceptual precision, not merely ideological proclamation. Confidence of the major conclusions. Conclusion, support. Power is a dominant organizing concept. Strongly supported. Avoidance of helplessness is a central motive. Strongly supported. Control is valued above emotional spontaneity. Strongly is deliberately theatrical. Strongly supported. Definitive, irreversible outcomes are psychologically attractive. Strongly supported. Individual welfare is subordinate to larger civilizational goals. Strongly supported. The speaker thinks hierarchically. Strongly supported. The speaker is conventionally nihilistic. Poorly supported, contradicted by the existence of strong terminal values. The speaker is straightforwardly egoistic. Poorly supported. The speaker is expansionist at the level of imagination philosophy. Strongly supported. The speaker is authoritarian. Moderately supported, complicated by explicit anti-tyranny restraints. The speaker is misanthropic, weak to moderate because contempt and instrumentalization coexist with fascination and romanticization. The speaker derives pleasure from suffering. Weakly supported. The speaker is emotionally detached. Moderately supported rhetorically, but impossible to generalize to ordinary life. The speaker uses intellectualization or abstraction to handle disturbing subjects. Strongly supported as a cognitive style, motive remains inferential. Grandiose thinking is present, strongly supported rhetorically. Grandiosity reflects a psychiatric condition, impossible to determine. The speaker literally believes they are divine, unsupported. The speaker endorses every hypothetical literally, unsupported. The speaker intends real-world mass violence, impossible to infer from this corpus. The speaker lacks empathy, impossible to determine.